What if the greatest charity movement of the 19th century was built on a lie? Not a conspiracy hatched in back rooms, but something quieter and perhaps more troubling, a shared fiction that an entire civilization chose not to examine too closely. Picture a city block in 1880, row after row of iron beds, children with cropped hair and numbered uniforms eating in silence beneath painted scripture. The building is solid brick, 6 stories tall, funded by some of the wealthiest donors in the country. Above the entrance, carved in stone, 2 words, Orphan Asylum. The public walks past and feels a swell of gratitude. These poor abandoned souls cared for, these parentless children given a future. But here is what that public did not know, and what the ledgers inside would reveal to anyone who looked closely enough. Many of those children had living parents, not a few, not a small exception. In city after city, reform investigators in the early 20th century uncovered a startling reality. In some institutions, up to 90% of so-called orphans had at least one parent still alive. Some had both. So the question is not what happened to those children. The question is what happened to the truth. Language is never neutral, and the word orphan in the 19th century was doing far more work than describing a child without parents. As industrial cities swelled through the mid-1800s, New York doubling in population, London choking with factory smoke, immigrant ships unloading thousands of families into neighborhoods with no sanitation and no safety net, a new kind of poverty became visible. Children selling matches on street corners, children sleeping in doorways, children whose fathers had lost fingers in machinery and whose mothers earned pennies washing other families' laundry. These children disturbed reformers, but they disturbed them in a complicated way, because their parents were often alive, nearby, and in many cases desperate to keep their families together. To call these children poor would have demanded structural answers, higher wages, housing reform, labor protections. Those solutions threatened powerful interests. But to call them orphans, to frame them as casualties of fate rather than casualties of capitalism, required only compassion. And compassion, unlike reform, asks nothing of the economic order. So the definition quietly stretched. A child with a deceased father and a living mother became a half-orphan. A child whose mother was ill and unable to work became, administratively, functionally orphaned. A child whose parents were simply destitute could be admitted on the basis of moral danger, a phrase that folded poverty into character failure without ever making that equation explicit. The word absorbed more and more reality until it no longer described a family tragedy. It described a social category. When investigators began examining admission records with fresh eyes, what they found was not ambiguous. The most common reasons listed for a child's entry into an orphanage were not both parents deceased or mother killed in epidemic. They were father unemployed, mother ill, parents unable to provide, temporary poverty. Temporary poverty. The word temporary is doing enormous work in that phrase. It implies that parents intended to return, that the arrangement was understood as short-term. Yet the records also show what happened next. Children remained institutionalized for years. Siblings were separated and sent to different placements. Names were sometimes changed. Reunification required families to prove financial stability to administrators who held all the power in the negotiation. Poverty got a child through the front door. Poverty also made it nearly impossible to use the exit. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, social surveyors noted that some parents visited when permitted. They brought small items. They asked after their children's health. These were not absent parents. These were parents trapped on the wrong side of an institutional wall that had been built, at least in part, to keep them there. Here is where the story sharpens into something structural. Many orphanages received per capita funding from municipal authorities and religious donors alike. The more children housed, the more money flowed in. This created no conspiracy, but it created an incentive. Empty beds were inefficient. Full dormitories demonstrated success. Growth became self-justifying. And these were not modest shelters. By the 1870s and 1880s, orphan asylums were architectural statements, enormous brick complexes with industrial kitchens, workshops, farms, and dormitories built for hundreds at a time. Buildings like these required populations to sustain them. Orphan Trains, the movement launched by Charles Loring Brace in 1854, transported an estimated 200,000 children from urban centers to rural homes across America over roughly 70 years. Brace described the children he was removing not primarily as bereaved, but as dangerous. Dangerous because they were poor, unsupervised, and visible. Records show that many children placed on those trains had living parents who had surrendered them during periods of financial crisis, often under the belief that the separation was temporary. Some of those children found genuine opportunity in their new homes. Others provided unpaid agricultural labor for farming families who had applied specifically for a child of working age. The line between rescue and redistribution was, in many cases, vanishingly thin. By the early 1900s, a small but growing group of reform advocates began raising the objection that had always been hiding in plain sight. Homer Folks and other progressive child welfare investigators calculated something that should have been obvious far sooner. In many cases, supporting a struggling mother directly through modest financial assistance would cost less than maintaining her child in an institution. If a small pension could keep a family together, then vast numbers of previous admissions had not been inevitable. They had been preventable. When several American states introduced mothers' pension programs after 1911, institutional populations began to fall. The correlation was direct and measurable. Economic support reduced so-called orphanhood. If orphanhood had been primarily about parental death, a pension would have changed nothing. Instead, it changed everything. This single fact is perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire historical record. It confirms that the crisis was never mainly about mortality. It was about economic design. And economic design can be changed. History tends to preserve policy and statistics. It is less careful with interiority, with what it felt like to be a child inside those walls, who knew, quietly and with certainty, that your mother was still alive 3 streets away. Scattered letters and memoirs hint at the dissonance. To be told you are an orphan while carrying the memory of a living face. To have your identity officially recorded as one of loss when your actual experience was one of separation. These are not equivalent things. Identity is shaped by the language others use for us. A child called an orphan internalizes a particular story about themselves, one of abandonment, of being without claim on the world. When that story is factually wrong, when the abandonment was economic rather than mortal, something essential has been distorted. The system did not only separate children from families, in many cases, it separated children from the truth of their own history. The orphanage era did not end because cruelty was exposed. It ended because understanding evolved. Reformers accumulated evidence, forced uncomfortable recalculations, and slowly shifted policy toward family preservation. The 1909 White House Conference on Dependent Children declared that home life was the superior environment for a child's development, a statement that would have been unnecessary if institutions had always been reserved for the truly parentless. Reform is implicit acknowledgement of overreach. What this history leaves us with is not simply a correction to the record, it is a method, a way of looking at categories that society treats as self-evident. When a single word compresses wildly different circumstances into one emotionally legible image, that compression is doing work. The question is always, whose interests does this simplification serve? The orphanage was not a monument to charity alone. It was a mirror held up to industrial society, reflecting back the cost that the poor were asked to pay, so that the wealthy could feel they had responded to it. The children inside those brick walls deserved more than rescue. They deserved a system that recognized their parents were not gone, they were just poor. And poverty, unlike death, has causes, and causes can be changed.